Right, so to our live, okay, I don't know.
I see a scary countdown.
All right. Okay, hello internet. We are live. To our live listeners, hello. We are going to pretend like it's the future because we're really lucky to have Fred here today, this week, but Astro's going 1.0. So, and the show officially drops on Friday. So the dozens of listeners that are live go to like tens of thousands like once the show drops. So we're gonna cater to that audience, everyone. But yeah. So just don't be confused. I know.
We have fallen into a wormhole where we are now
Yes.
talking about the past and the future, and the future is the
And
past.
the past is the future, and the future is the past. Honestly, that's like my life since 2020. It's like, what day of the week is it, and what am I supposed to be doing right now?
Yeah.
But anyway, so Fred, I'm so excited to have you back on this show. Yeah, this is like, I don't know, maybe the third time you've been on Jay's Party, but the first time you've been on Jay's Party with me, and I'm back on the show. So to like live listeners and whoever's catching this, I'm like haven't been on the show in a while, but excited to be back. And
So I
so
haven't been on either. It's been like 3 years or 2 years. Like it's been a COVID since I've been on. So this is a nice little coming
I'm
home for
back.
me
I
too.
know. I know. Do you need a minute? Do you need to like walk around and stretch? No,
I
you're
already did
good.
that.
You're like, I'm good. I'm good. Okay. All right. Well, if you're ready, you've got water. Your sound is good. Your local recording is good. I'm gonna take a sip
Cheers.
and
Cheers.
cheers. It's actually this is the name of my town on this glass. It was like my husband and I bought this as the first thing we when we moved here because we didn't have all of our furniture yet. So we went to like the local store and bought the like $20 glass. That's it. So, anyways,
Nice.
okay, all right, we can get started. Music coming. One, two, three, four. All right, hello, party people. Well, you're like party nerds. It's Amel Hussein here today. Haven't been here in a hot minute. Had a lot going on. All is well now, and very happy to be back. And I was a little worried because we were dancing to the intro music, and Fred, our guest, I kind of ruined the surprise, but Fred started to pixelate, and I was like, oh no. Fred, this is the dancing's too hot. You're like, burning up your wire,
No, I'm glad
so,
that was captured forever for everyone to watch. That's
oh
great to
yeah,
know. Definitely
right.
dance knowing that, certainly.
Yeah, certainly. So without further ado, it's just me here today, and we have a really special guest, Fred Schott, with us. Fred will tell you all about himself in just a second. We're here to talk about Astro with Fred, which is really kind of this bleeding edge, cutting all the JavaScript edges, web UI framework that we're gonna learn tons about today. But before we dig into Astro, Fred, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and welcome.
Yeah,
Welcome
awesome. I'm
back.
really excited to be on. It's been like years and a long time, and this is just really fun to be back on. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank
Um,
you. Thank you for being
yeah,
here.
my background is I've been working in open source for a long time now, mostly in JavaScript tooling. So a couple projects that you might know me from: Snowpack, Skypack. Before that, I worked on the Polymer team at Google.
Woo-hoo.
A bunch of other just small little open source repos, and most recently working on a project called Astro, which we're going to get into here because I got to get this right with the time vortex we're in. It has just launched by the time you're listening to this. So I'm really excited
Yes.
to share it because it's really new and exciting and is an awesome tool that we've been working really hard on.
Yeah, exactly. And you're kind of underselling yourself because Fred, I feel like you're like, I don't know, if there ever was a JavaScript Illuminati, I feel like you would definitely be one of those members because, I really do think of you as somebody who's always pushed the community forward and you've never really been afraid of putting yourself out there and like making bold bets and also just really, flipping the table on the status quo. I think you have even, you didn't mention Pika package manager that really, you were just like, yeah, I don't really care if NPM exists. I'm gonna just go head to head with just like try to create a mechanism to surface, packages that have ECMAScript 6, ECMA modules, right? So like, how do I do this, right? So I mean, I feel like you've always really been bold, and I feel like you've always tried to really push the community forward. So like, thank you for that.
Oh my God, thank you. That's very
It's,
kind, and I
but
don't know
it's
if it's
true.
deserved, but
It's
yeah, the
true
last
though.
episode I was on, actually, Jared was just telling me was me like pitching ES modules, which now 3 years later, it's like, oh yeah, that's what we're all using. Like
Yeah,
Vite
right.
is like the thing people are using now. That's all happened.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, thank
So
you.
yeah. So like lesson to y'all who are listening is like, sometimes these arguments just take a while to kind of settle, and like, 3 years later you can look back at old arguments on Twitter and say, okay, yeah, this person was clearly on the right side of this argument, right? And sometimes it just takes a while for the community to catch up, right? So anyway, so Astro is kind of just came out with its 1.0, but it's really not new. I mean, it's new, yes, but not really. I feel like, I've been hearing about Astro for a while. I've been seeing you all push stuff, and it's been this slow kind of reveal. So can you kind of give us some timelines and give us some insights into kind of like how long have you been working on this project and what motivated it?
Yeah, it's like every overnight success, there's years in the
Yeah,
making.
yeah,
This
every
this
overnight
really traces
success.
back to even that Pika story, but Astro itself, I think, is about, if you go back to the first commit, like a year and a half old. So we've really been working on this for a while, trying to get it right before we kind of stamp it with that V1. The best way to explain it is it's essentially a content focused or content driven web framework. So if you're thinking of how you want to build your website and you're looking at like Next.js, SvelteKit, or Nuxt, or maybe you're looking at like a static Jamstack builder like Eleventy or Hugo, we're trying to be the best choice for anyone who's building a content site. So marketing sites, portfolios, blogs, personal sites. If the focus of what you're building is content, getting content to someone who's trying to read or consume that content, that's what we're trying to be the best at. And we have a lot of really cool features that are kind of designed explicitly for that use case, where we see other frameworks optimizing more for apps and dashboards and really complex use cases, which are all well and good. But we see a real opportunity here to build a framework for people who build content sites. And so that's what Astro is.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense, Fred. I feel like for me, that's like a really refreshing kind of, I think, motivator and perspective because to some degree, like even things like AMP were really created, right, to focus on, all right, well, we have all these kind of static sites that need to get to users faster. What do we do? Oh, I know. Let's just limit all the JavaScript, right? And also come up with our own cryptic set of rules. And oh, I don't know, like use private servers to uh, prioritize caching and blah, blah, blah. And maybe a
Right.
few years down the line, make a lot of publishers and whoever angry, right? So, for
Yeah,
better or worse,
we're gonna make
yeah.
the web faster by making it only what we let you do in this little sandbox, and therefore the web is fast now and good. And yeah, that's pretty
Right.
antithetical to a lot of things
Yeah.
about the web.
Right. But again, I appreciate for me, right? I appreciate the experiment. I appreciate the innovation and I appreciate the intent, right? So now like how do we kind of further evolve from that, right? And it feels like Astro's kind of taking a step in that direction. I think for me, like this focus on content and content like websites, if that's your niche, I mean, I'd say like, okay, great job picking a niche because that's really the majority of the internet, right?
Yeah,
It's a,
as far as
it's
niches go, you
right,
can't really get much bigger.
right.
I think the last number that I saw is like around 60% of the internet is like, or the top 500 sites are that type of content focused site. So yeah, as far as niches go, it's a big one.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, where would places like Reddit fall into that spectrum? Because I feel like Reddit is like so heavy on content. It's like read, read, read for the most part, and then there's some interactivity there as well from users, but that's like user generated content. I feel
Yeah,
like,
I,
so like where does that kind of fall in that spectrum for you?
I think you used the right word, which is spectrum. It's definitely different sites and even different pages within a site can kind of take different forms. So, yeah, Reddit, like the creation of content is much more interactive than just reading the content. And then once you get into the comments, it's,
Yeah,
there's a lot of little interactive bits.
right.
I'd say so we like that like content focus because it really kind of is our North Star. But there's really cool features that kind of back that up. So the big one is thinking about how you architect your site. The biggest difference from Astro, the biggest difference that Astro has from others is that we really like this idea of generating your page. It's all static HTML, and then you're hydrating like the interactive bits around the page. So for some things, if everything is connected data, like you post something here, it updates the dashboard there, like this doesn't work for every use case. But for content, when the majority of the site is actually the static thing that you're consuming, it really works well to kind of color in almost within the lines, like a paint by numbers. Well, here's the kind of interactive comment here, here's the button here, here's the navigation there. The benefit of that is that you're actually only hydrating individual parts of the site. And the performance benefit there is that you're not sending down this entire JavaScript app to your users, you're sending down these little snippets. So that's the biggest difference. Reddit works really well. Hacker News is kind of this like demo that people like to benchmark Astro against. Yeah. Get the Next.js Hacker News versus the SvelteKit Hacker News versus the Astro. And the interesting thing about Astro is, unlike all those other ones, we don't have to send a JavaScript app to render that page and make it interactive. We're just making sure the comment button is interactive, the navigation's interactive. It's much more selective and therefore much more fast. We're just sending way less JavaScript down to your users at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, I again, like, it's another really refreshing take, and I think another way that I think Astro and the folks involved with the project as a whole have really helped push the community's thinking on this. And we'll get into some really cool stuff in a second, like islands, and no, not islands in the sun, which is what I always think of. I'm like, islands in this, no, different kinds of islands. But I think what's interesting for me is that, thinking about architecture that way means that you're also always kind of planning for that fast by default experience, right? And you're being very intentional about what you want to be expensive. And like versus kind of this opposite world that we've been living in for however many years, or, where it's like we're just by default, like everything is chunky and heavy. And we ship it, and then we start subtracting from there after the fact. It's kind of painful. Like, no wonder teams have so much difficulty like making their apps performant. Like, we're just, we're speaking English when we need to be speaking Italian or something like that, right? It's like, what are we even doing? So it kind of like, are we using the right tools? Are we using the right methodology? Are we using the right architecture? Like, I would say no, right? And so I think it's like, I mean, I've said this before on the show. I'll say it again. Might make some people upset, right? But for me in 2022, like love tools like React, but I mean, with their own set of problems and whatnot. But generally, like, I wouldn't, if I wasn't designing for a multi-platform use case where I needed this to run in a native application or in a VR headset or whatever, like if I just needed this to be on the web, I would not be using a tool like React to like create a simple website. I just wouldn't. It's just too chunky. It's not just, there's too much overhead, too much, it comes with too much, it's got too many pieces of luggage,
So
and
I'll take the other side of that, and you need to stop me because I will talk about that. I find the history of like how we got to where we are fascinating, but I actually don't. And I think I'm in the minority of like the web perf like diehards here, but I don't know if I find React the problem as much as I find the everything is React kind of thinking, and that then applies like everything is Svelte, everything is Vue. Where if you imagine like even like a simple Hello World Next.js site, and I'm not picking on Next.js, this is like the model that they use that everyone else is using. You're not just sending down the like, a Hello World. There's nothing really interactive, but you're sending down JavaScript to power it. And this history goes all the way back to like Create React App, where and Jamstack really kind of pushed this because there were a lot of benefits to it. But the thinking that your whole site is a JavaScript app, it's rendering on the client, you're only thinking in one code base, you have this really nice separation of concerns, your backend's an API, your UI is all one code base. Like there's really nice organizational things that people love.
From the developer's perspective, right? Isn't that DX though?
The DX is incredible. It's unbeatable.
Hard to beat,
Versus PHP, I worked on sites where you're rendering HTML with PHP and then you're also rendering it again with React. It's like you're trying to keep two code bases. I've seen some bad stuff. But it's that idea of like the DX was so good, but then we just took that path, and 10 years later we found ourselves where we keep adding complexity and adding more code to solve a problem that is inherently too much code. That's our take on it. That it's not that React's the problem, it's that we've way over-indexed on how much is powered by React or Vue or Svelte. At the end of the day, the more code you're asking the user to run, you're just fighting physics at that point. That's code that has to run on your user's device. It's going to slow it down.
Yeah. No, I mean that makes a ton of sense. And it goes back to like the intentionality of what we're doing and how often like we're all working under such constraints and such like there's, cow paths that also the community has paved, right? There's best practices. There's tools like CRA that like, create React app that make things so easy and just one button and right? Like, if we're not careful about the complexities that we're abstracting, right? Like if we're abstracting away things like that are okay, generally best practices and good decisions, like great, but like the risk of mass adoption and abstracting away some of those things, like is you're making bad decisions that you didn't even make, you're just the tool made it
Exactly.
for you, right?
Yeah, the way we phrase it is like create React app and a lot of others, they'll, if you ever look in your node modules when you install something with create React
Oh
app, there's I think
gosh.
like 2,000 packages,
Yeah.
2,000 dependencies, all sitting on top of each other. And we call that like it's complexity, but kind of wrapped and like hidden from you. But then when you
Mm-hmm.
want to go and do something new, it's either, the tool says, no, you can't do that. Like there's too
Mm-hmm.
much here, you're going to mess it up. Or like, okay, but be careful. If anything breaks, good luck finding which one of the 2,000 dependencies is causing that problem.
Right.
So it's like we've hidden complexity for so long. What I love about this kind of new wave of tools like Astro is what if we just actually removed a lot of that complexity?
Mm-hmm.
What if we dropped down what you have to think about when you build and instead gave you something that starts from first principles, web
Mm-hmm.
standards, HTML? I think that's
Right.
a much better place than just continuing to wrap the complexity in more and more layers of abstraction.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense, and like put the onus on the developer to intentionally make the decisions about where they want to take the app in terms of like which sections am I bulking up, and being very intentional about those decisions. Also, like everyone when they have the time to think about it typically like comes to the right conclusions,
Yeah,
but it's just actually like have we even thought about what we're doing really,
yeah,
right? Most of us are just like on autopilot, and in all fairness to create React app, I don't think anybody could have predicted the way it was going to take off. Like clearly there was a need in the community for all of like kind of like having more boilerplate templates that would serve and manage away all of the JavaScript tooling complexity, right? Because there is some fatigue there from the community, and like that's something that we can't like not talk about, right? Because
yeah.
like that is a real thing, real problem, right? And React was also the first application, right? We've talked about this on the show before, that went to NPM land and like said, okay, JavaScript front end developers, we're gonna go hijack the Node community now because we need Node tooling to build a JavaScript app. And that was a shift that happened, and then we
Yeah.
then we ended up with a bunch of needed to build your front end app, and right,
Yeah,
and
and
like
then Node changed, and all the tools have to. Yeah,
right,
we
and
really
six.
like this term all in one, and I think it's a larger trend. I think Deno kind of falls into this, like Bun, if you've seen that. Like I think people are starting to feel more comfortable presenting something as a full, complete platform and not a collection of 2,000 different packages all hopefully working together.
Because it's
So we
hard
like
to
this idea of
maintain.
Astro being a really stable runtime, almost, or platform or foundation, whatever you want to call it, that is much more like, build on top of this and we got you.
I'm gonna just cut there. I think that's like a good place for the break, because next thing I wanted to go into was like a whole other discussion.
Yeah,
So I
sure.
want to kick into like content focused, server first, fast by default, easy to use, full featured, but flexible. And then from there go into some of the first deeper topics. Like maybe we can focus on MPA versus SPA after that discussion, and then probably take a break because that'll be a big discussion. And then from there, we can end on islands and like what's next and future and blah, blah, blah.
Cool.
Does that sound good?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
islands could make. Yeah, let's
Or
see.
or
We
do you
could
want to
probably.
bump up islands? I mean, because
No, I was gonna say islands and MPA versus SPA are similar enough that there might be a way that it just naturally flows into it.
okay.
But yeah,
Then let's
I
talk
agree
about
that.
it.
Yeah,
Too. I think there's so much here. Because I wanna there's so much I want to get into, like for example, like the opting into complexity, the BYOF thing, right? Like I want to
yeah.
get into like the plugins and ecosystem and
I
whatever
know. Here we
else.
are just talking about ancient history. Create React app.
I know. I'm
That's old stuff.
sorry.
Let's talk about the
Well,
new
it's
stuff.
important to set the tone. I think,
Oh, I
we
brought
only
it up.
talk,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
I was gonna say we have to give people a frame of reference for like
Yeah,
how is this different than the thing that you know?
yeah.
So that's fine. How about we do MPA islands, blah blah blah, and then we can talk about the extensibility,
Yeah.
community plugging in, and all that stuff in the last segment.
Yeah, everything that I've described as like the other way of doing things is all SPA, and then we're trying to do this MPA thing different. So I think there's a natural transition there from what we've just talked about.
Okay. Okay, perfect. But I'm first going to start with like the marketing bits. So, okay. All
Cool.
right. All right. You need a water? Do you need a bathroom break, stretch break? I'm
I'll
going to
do
take a
that.
sip of water.
I'll do one of these.
Yes. Okay. All right. My room is boiling because we had like mosquito people here spraying. And windows are all closed now, but
Oh
we also
God, I'm so
we don't
sorry.
need there's only like 15 days in the year, well, maybe 20 days in the year where I feel like I really wish I had air conditioning, but every right? So
Yeah.
this is one of those days.
Where are you based out of? Remind me.
Boston during the pandemic, we bought a house in the Berkshires. You should come.
Where
It's like
is that
Western
New York?
Massachusetts. It's
Oh, Mass.
yes, it's magical. It might as well be New York because all the New Yorkers come up here.
Okay. We're actually doing a
Um,
team offsite in Boston in 2 weeks. I might take you up on that. If you'll be
Dude,
around.
come. Yes. Yeah. 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 Like you're. Let's talk after this. Okay.
Okay, sure.
This is very
Sure.
exciting. All right. Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah, Fred, that was really insightful and super interesting, kind of digging into some of the context and history behind some of the motivations of Astro. And like just kind of, y'all make some pretty bold promises here. I kind of will list through some of those, right? So Astro's content focused, server first, fast default, easy to use, and fully featured but flexible, right? And I think that's interesting. That's a tough, fully featured but flexible. I mean, that's like how do you make it easy for newbies to get started and make good decisions without having to really think about it? And how do you not hold back power users, right? Like
Yeah.
that's like the always the struggle with API design.
Yeah.
And so let's get into some of this. So we've talked a lot about the content focus piece. Can we talk about the server first piece? Because there's quite a bit here with just being server first. For me, it's like there. I kind of read that like y'all are promising that this renders in the server, so you don't have to ever worry about any state management or whatever else unless you want to. But
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, what does that even mean? Can you explain that to folks?
Yeah, no, definitely. So it really ties back to what we were just talking about because what we see is we're flipping the model a bit where if the last 10 years have been all about like, let's build a big JavaScript app that
Mm-hmm.
runs on the client and the server, we're
Mm-hmm.
saying let's go back to when a lot of the work happened on the server because there's really nice performance implications there. So this is a kind of message that a lot of other frameworks are starting to try to tell, but we have this really unique opportunity to just tell it from a fully like fundamental what we do best is generate HTML and then make it interactive versus what we do best being like a JavaScript application. So the way that we see it is that we are very server first. The templating language that kind of comes built into Astro is essentially Sugar on top of creating HTML templates. It's a nice way to work with HTML. And then we pair that with a way to bring different components in only when you need them. So if you like React or you like Vue or Svelte, you can actually use those components to build your UI. But again, by default, we're just going to render them out server rendered to HTML and zero JavaScript being sent down the wire unless you kind of like opt into it. You say like, no, this component should be interactive. Give me the JavaScript. I'll pay the cost for the user's performance, but I'll get this really nice interactive component. Versus every other framework is default. I'll send it all. They might need all of it, so just send it all.
I see.
We've flipped that model.
That makes sense. So I guess like how do you all handle this uncanny valley that we get with server side rendering where it's like, well, it looks great because it's like, oh, this came fast and it looks interactable. Then I try to click it right away and like, oh, nothing's happening. Oh, JavaScript's still parsing and loading, right? Some of that can be managed by reducing the amount of JavaScript that you send, but you're still just gaming the system, right? And it's never gonna be 0 seconds or 0 milliseconds to process that JavaScript chunk. So like, how are you dealing with that, if at all? Like, are we just kind of leveraging the fact that like because the users have to be intentional and opt in, it's usually a lot less JavaScript. Like and then there's also no framework JavaScript that's being sent along with this, right? I'm just curious, like how are you managing that Uncanny
Yeah.
Valley?
No, that's the problem that Astro like exists to solve for, which the Uncanny Valley is a result of the fact that okay, we're going to server-side render your JavaScript application in one of these other frameworks, and then we're going to send the whole page down as a full application, and nothing's going to be interactive until all of it is. That's really a uniquely SPA kind of problem. That's really a uniquely kind of that model problem that we just don't have. You still do need to make sure that your components can handle, what happens if they fall back to good behaviors. But the nice thing about when we can kind of hydrate in different components, we're doing that in isolation in parallel. So where large JavaScript applications suffer from the problem of everything has to load before anything can be interactive, there's this really nice model where we can actually treat every component on the page differently. So for example, if it's not visible, we're not going to run it. Like until the user scrolls down to it, that's when we'll hydrate it. That's a really cool, like uniquely Astro feature because we're treating that component isolated from everything else on the page. And the other being like, if something's really a high priority, you can bump up how quickly it loads, and you can also load that without worrying that something really big and heavy is going to block it. So your big heavy image carousel lower on the page, that's not going to block the buy button that's somewhere in the middle of the page from becoming interactive and loading. So it's a much more decoupled, and by result, things that are like really essential can load much faster because we let you kind of control what loads when and how high priority it is.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so, like, there is this like waterfall that you get with ECMA, like unbundled ECMA, modules, right? Like if you have a bunch of different JavaScript chunks, like true loading in parallel, like is that even achievable really in the browser these days? Like I don't know. You tell me, Fred. Like,
Yeah, I mean that kind of gets into something else you mentioned, which is the fast by default.
uh-huh.
Just because these things can load in parallel doesn't mean we've like blown away all the performance optimizations of bundling and minification. We
Okay.
still do that. But it's a really interesting model. Instead of saying, okay, here's your whole page as a single JavaScript bundle, we're saying almost like here's each component as its own. Again, island is a term we like to use. It's its own bundle. It can load in parallel. And so you actually are getting still bundled and optimized without you really having to think much about it. But it's a result of us kind of behind the scenes still giving you the model while handling the complexity of it behind the scenes for you.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. That's so there is some intelligence that's under like being managed under the hood in terms of like optimizations that are still happening.
Yeah.
Is great.
It's a big thing of trying to keep that away from the user having to. And it's kind of like it's the trick of how do you talk about your framework when every framework claims to be fast.
Right.
But what we like to say is it's fast by default, which I don't think any other framework can really claim. What we mean by that is like it should be hard to build a slow site with Astro. Because for content sites, performance is so key. It's key to conversions and Google SEO. They're going to rank faster sites over slower sites.
Right.
In a lot of other frameworks, you're kind of like, okay, well, we built a slow site. What do we do? Okay, well, we can optimize. Let's bring in a performance expert. Let's spend a sprint on just performance, and maybe you can make some progress. But we want to come from a principle of like, it should be really difficult. You should be like having to try to make Astro slow for it to be slow.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we like just keeping you out of that pit is really a main goal of the project.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So that like that's really great to hear, and I would say that like I think that's an interesting nuance that I didn't even pick up on. Your docs like fast by default. Yes, you're right. It is the by default part that I think you need to like bold that or something, or like put some confetti around it or something.
Yeah,
So and
like
another
you have to try. You got to break Astro to break our
yeah.
performance story. That's our goal.
That's cool. Good marketing. And so another on the Astro site is easy to use, and I noticed there is a .astro UI language that's kind of part of this framework. So can you kind of tell me a little bit about that? And easy to use is a tough claim because that's always relevant. But like, how easy is it? Like, is it as
Yeah.
easy as JSX, right? Where it's like it looks like HTML sort of, but still, comes with its I would say dragons, right? If you
Yeah.
so it's easy here.
Yeah, I will call out that what you're reading is kind of like our aspirations. Like we want
Mm-hmm.
Astro to be easy to use, and we make design decisions for that goal over maybe something else like a really complex feature that's really hard to use. We'll avoid that even if maybe there's some reason to do it other than, we it's something that we really value is we want to always be easy to use
Mm-hmm.
when we design Astro as a language, as a framework, as a platform, all these things.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree. When a friend like, why use this? Oh, it's easy to use. Like I'm always like, oh, again, everyone says that, but it's our aspiration. We really value that over other things that other frameworks might value over ease of use.
Okay.
Um,
That makes sense. And so can you give me an example of like an easy to use API in the
yeah.
library? Like something that's
So you mentioned,
uniquely easy to use in Astro than some other framework that whoever might be using.
yeah. So you mentioned the .astro file, which I think is a really good example of how we're kind of trying to give two things here to you, like basically two different paths you can go down, and you can mix them as you want. So if you love React, you love Svelte, you love Vue, bring those into your project. They're going to work just like anything else to generate your UI. So there's this idea of kind of bringing something to feel comfortable pretty much from day one using Astro. Even if you're migrating a site, like bring that site as long as there weren't like framework specific bits. If it's just a React component that's like super agnostic,
Hmm.
fantastic. It'll probably work in Astro, assuming you kind of meet that. You didn't bring in anything that was framework specific from the old world.
Yeah. And
And then .astro is us. Oh, sorry.
oh, no, go ahead, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say just the other side of that is .astro is us building a templating language that's really just HTML. So one of these things about using React or Svelte or Vue is you're having to learn a framework that was built for the client side. So it's dealing with
Hmm.
reactivity and hooks and these like atoms that are responding to state changes. Like those are all frameworks that were designed first for the client, which has a much more complex interaction story, and then have kind of been backported to the
Mm,
server because we're so server first in our thinking. Like Astro is just a templating language for the server. There's no reactivity to worry about. There's no hooks. Like everything's going to run once and render, and
yeah.
that gives us essentially something that's just HTML. So we call it like HTML with some like nice to have features, like a
Hmm.
JSX expression if you want to do some sort of templating. You can use components in it, so it feels a lot like a Svelte or React, but we've stripped away all the bits that aren't really relevant on the server. So
Yeah.
you have your kind of framework that you love, and then also we try and give you this baseline that's just HTML with a couple of little things you can opt into if you want them.
That's so cool. And yeah, honestly, I didn't even really put those things together in my head. Really, like when you optimize for server first, then when you're optimizing for HTML, you also by default like it's just easy to use because you're not like, yeah, reactivity is really where it's located, right?
Yeah,
That's like the 201, 301, 401, 501 classes,
yeah,
HTML is like it's really
yeah,
beginner friendly, but doesn't hold you back on in terms of presenting structurally complex data or sites either, right? So that's like the beauty of HTML.
yeah. It's
Um,
it's something that's always bothered me of like, oh, this Hello World tutorial. Well, you need to learn a bundler, you need to learn JSX, you need to learn React, you need to learn a state management system, a router. Like, ooh, there's like a lot to learn in web development today, and it's all about rendering HTML at the end of the day. So could we build a kind of getting started flow that is just HTML, like valid HTML works
yeah.
as a template, as a component in our syntax. So if you just want to copy an HTML from anywhere, put in an Astro site, that's a site. You've just built a site with Astro. That's our Hello World.
That makes sense. And fully featured but flexible is the other thing, right? So you hinted a little bit about like bring your own site. You can kind of BYOF, which is a thing that you all very cool. What does that even mean? Like, there's over 100 Astro integrations to choose from. Like, what are Astro? It sounds like a physics seminar of some kind, but I could be
Yeah, you
wrong.
got to put on your lab coat, put on your goggles,
Yeah.
jump into your config files.
Current astral projection for this equation is,
Oh no.
yeah, no, no. I
Oh,
mean,
I'm
it's okay. Listen, this is why I don't like writing. Like, it's hard. As Astro integrations, I'm sure, make sense in the context of web development. So, and in the context of Astro. So, why don't you tell us about what that is? So,
Yeah, no, I'm just laughing because I'm never going to be able to get that image out of my mind for the
Okay,
rest of my life.
I'm sorry.
It's
Astro
okay.
integrations. Yeah.
Um,
Anyways,
yeah,
it's
yeah, it's
hilarious.
our plugin ecosystem. We really like this idea of
Mm-hmm.
our core providing all the things you need. So when you install Astro, you
Mm-hmm.
have the basic building blocks of a site. But then, this idea of bringing your own framework, it's a pretty lofty, big scope kind of goal.
Mm.
We couldn't build everything into core without it just becoming this maintenance nightmare. So
Right.
what we offer is this idea of like everything you need to build a site and is built into Astro. We're going to focus on content sites, so stuff like RSS feeds. God, what else? Rendering Markdown.
Mm-hmm.
God, there's another one that I'm missing. There's like all these nice little, like very much more coming from like a blog or like an 11D,
Mm-hmm.
nice to haves that are
Mm-hmm.
essential in the content site. So we
Mm-hmm.
build stuff like that in or make it really easy to grab off the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you want to use something like Tailwind or React or Svelte, we essentially have not just a kind of a plugin and integration, but also even a command that you can run. So Astro add React is going to do all the work to get that set up for you. It's going to
Oh wow.
npm install the package. It's going to add it to your config file as you'd expect. And
Mm-hmm.
the idea is you run that, and now you can use a React component in your project, or
That is
Svelte or
that's
Vue or Tailwind or whatever it is you
yeah.
need.
That is so cool. But like I have to ask, like as maintainers, what is it like trying to normalize the JavaScript community? Because it feels like that's what you're doing. You're like, we're just gonna run a big normalization query on the JavaScript community. Are you just public? Are you like hooking into the public interface or like the output of these tools? And like I'm just because it's too much to like go any lower. But I'm just curious, like how are you managing this and normalizing this experience? Like,
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the key of why the .astro syntax exists. It gives us
mm-hmm,
that base layer where you can
mm-hmm,
then plug in these frameworks into it. So create your shell and then put in your React component. And if you wanted to build an SPA, if you wanted your whole page to be one React component or
mm-hmm.
many React components, you never wanted to touch Astro's syntax, that's fine too. But that's kind of the normalization layer. I think that's actually pretty much exactly the magic that we've kind of shipped.
Yeah.
The reason that it's not too much for us to lift is that server-side rendering a React component, that's essentially what every other framework is doing for your whole site. We're
Mm-hmm.
just doing it shrunken down to a single component. So it's
Mm-hmm.
almost this full circle story where React started early days. It was like, yep, here's a component, here's a component. It was all front-end focused. And then the kind of build your app as a JavaScript app with React, that all came later. But we're just tapping into that original story, which is use React to build this component on the page.
Mm-hmm.
All the same APIs work. So we're basically doing the same thing that Next.js is doing, or any React framework that is going
Yeah.
to call the like server rendering internally to create that HTML.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. All right. Well, I mean, we're gonna get nicely into the next thing I wanted to talk to you about. I'm gonna save that for after the break. I hear about this opting into complexity and what is this islands architecture that Astro is promoting, and applications versus single page applications. Like, let's talk about the pros and cons. That's a really big principle of the framework. And so we're going to get into all that and more just after these quick messages, kids. Be right back. Okay. Boom. All right.
We're gonna
So
tie it all together. We're
we're
gonna
gonna tie
land
it
this
all together.
plane.
Yes. Yes. I knew there was going to
Perfect.
be a lot to talk about. I didn't want to rush this. So like
Smart.
all really good stuff. So, and really this is like the best for last. We'll save it for like, so all right. So do you need a stretch break, water break, anything?
I'm good.
You're good?
It's so funny. Every time you ask me that, I'm reminded of I used to have a boss who, before every meeting, he'd say he had to go to the bathroom,
Uh-huh.
and we realized he was doing this thing. Have you heard this thing where if you do like a Superman pose,
Oh
you
yeah,
actually are like tricking your brain into
into
being more
being more
confident?
confident.
He would go into the bathroom for like 3 minutes before every meeting and just do this. I
That's
always think about that.
hilarious.
It's like, you want a break? It's like, yeah, I kind of do just want to do that for a while.
Oh yeah,
Right.
well, it's a wrong person.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
no, that's cool. All right. Well, after we've Superman, Superwoman, Superperson, I'm ready to jump back in.
Let's
So
do
if
it.
you're good, we're good. All right. Let's do this. I'm so impressed at my ability to stay on time today because you have no idea. I am like the queen of like, oh shit, like let's just keep rolling. We'll figure out when the editors will figure out when to cut in a break, or like, oh shit, it's 25 minutes. Like, like this is really impressive.
I
maybe
love
some
it. That's
time away
awesome. I
with
mean,
some time away was good.
I'm probably not the easiest client here. I'm sure I could talk about this stuff for hours, so I'm happy
Yeah,
we're on
no,
schedule.
likewise. And no, you're doing great. Just keep doing what you're doing. All right, so jump back in. Podcast face. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, Fred. So this is the part of the show where I get to sing Islands in the Sun. Something one. I don't even da 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 da. I don't know. Anyways, either way, as soon as I like every time I see Astro Islands, like that song pops into my head. But then on your actual documentation site, you have a quote, islands, not as in like real islands, but islands islands in a sea of static, non-interactive HTML.
Yeah, very
I,
visual, right? Just a nice little island getaway in the middle
yeah,
of the ocean of HTML.
yeah, just swimming in a sea of div tags, Where's my span, like my footer? I'm like getting a little uncomfortable here. Seriously, it's kind of hilarious, really. But I'm so excited. I finally get to talk about this with you. I've been meaning to pick your brain about this. Now I get to do this on air. Yay. So opt into complexity is a core kind of principle of Astro. Opt into complexity. So a little bit about opt into complexity and islands and how those two relate like and what the hell are islands? Please educate us.
Yeah.
I think we might
Yeah,
have hinted at it a little bit already, but we haven't explicitly called it out.
yeah, so I mean, credit where it's due. We did not come up with this term. I would just say we were kind of the first framework to make it this like core primitive. Like Astro is a framework for building island architecture, for building sites with this idea of thinking in islands. I believe it was originally coined by, I want to get her name right, Katie Saylor Miller, who was Etsy's front-end architect. But then Jason Miller, creator of Preact, he did a kind of blog post really outlining it. So this is going back to 2019 in terms of a concept, but now here in 2022, it was always this like really hard thing to do. So it never really was very popular. And then we really, I think our claim to fame, if anything, was making this pattern really easy and kind of baked in by default. Yeah, it's kind of I think we're going to tie it all together here because this island architecture it's really at the core of how we see ourselves as different from everyone else, which is the idea of thinking of your site as mainly static content with islands of interactivity. So, I mean, choose any kind of content site. It can be e-commerce, it can be a recipe blog, it can be CNN.com. The main thing that they're trying to do is get a lot of content in front of you. There's an article you got to read. Maybe there's comments to interact with, but the majority of the focus is on this giving something to you to consume. Without that sounds like lame, but it's what a
Yeah.
lot of the internet is based on. It's a
Yeah.
major part of why we go
Yeah,
online.
it's food for your brain. That's
Exactly.
sometimes it's healthy, right? Just like life. So,
Exactly.
sometimes
Um,
it's just fun, like cat content. I
exactly.
mean, let's be real, like
Exactly.
the internet was definitely invented just to show off cats. So
Everything else is just the extra cherry
everything
on
else
top.
is just like, yeah, who cares
Yeah.
really? It's just there to
So
fill in
you've
the
got your
spaces.
cat photo site built with Astro. The idea is that the majority of that is the cat photo. It's the comments, people being, "Wow, cute cat." That's
Yeah.
all really, really lightweight for users' browsers to kind of consume. So the
Hmm.
browser can show that really quickly. And on the flip side, then everything that is kind of proven to be true about performance in that for content sites gets to play out for you basically for free. So it loads faster. It means less users kind of bounce off your site,
Hmm.
especially in slower devices like mobile devices, slower networks, developing
Hmm.
countries. We take for granted that, like, especially as web developers, we're working on like a MacBook Pro M2 chip on
Hmm.
our wired Ethernet that I've got plugged in right now. Like, I load up any site on my computer, it's probably going to load pretty quickly. That's completely not realizing that like there's a mobile phone out there that is just chugging along on even the most simple site, and that can be a large percentage of the world, especially if you're building something globally or even for your own country. It's easy to forget that a lot of us do live in these bubbles of incredibly fast devices, incredibly fast internet. And that's what I think Google's done a really good job of pushing with the Web Vitals and Lighthouse scores, is really
Hmm.
bringing people back down to earth. This giant JavaScript application that you're sending down to some lower powered devices, it's not going to cut it. You're going to lose users. That's the problem we're really existing to solve because it's so important for content sites.
Yeah, yeah. This is a podcast, so everyone's gonna have to close their eyes and use their imagination. But imagine your website page as the box, the big rectangular, and then in that rectangle are lots of other little boxes, right? That kind of really break up the architecture of like, your nav bar, your footer, your main content, etc. And it's like really kind of carving out each thing as its own little island and maybe optionally opting in complexity into one of those little boxes, right? Like, hey, I want JavaScript and interactivity here, but maybe even that's conditional to maybe like internet speed or whatever, right? Like I think what's cool about this architecture is I think you get to kind of insert your business logic wherever you want, right? I mean, like
Yes.
ultimately we're the designers of these applications as developers. So we know the needs of our users the best. We know the thing that's important to them. We know the things that are less important, right? And so I think it's cool having a framework that allows you to like inject that intention into your application code and in terms of its behavior and performance. Like that's like, I don't know if I'm allowed to say the word, but that's BADAS, right? I don't want
Do we bleep on this podcast?
we do. I'll just say the word. It's badass. If it gets bleeped, I'm sorry, Jared. But that's so cool, right? I think for me, like this is where again, like I don't really care about usage here, right? I don't care if people are using Astro or not. For me, it's the forward thinkingness, right? So like this is like TED, technology, was it education design? I don't even know. I have no idea. Whatever TED stands for. Their motto is ideas worth spreading. For me, this is like an idea worth spreading, right?
Yeah.
And so I do hope to see this kind of as a as a way of developing performant applications. And really, at the end of the day, performance is about creating the best user experience, and like also just meeting the needs of your users, like having empathy and understanding that like
Yeah.
sometimes you're just trying to buy a ticket on a train and like like you got to optimize for that hot path. And I think
Yeah.
what's cool about Islands architecture, I feel like it gives you an easy way to optimize for the hot path, and progressively layer in the fluff.
Yeah.
And so I think that's super cool.
Yeah, and I think what I love kind of on that point is like these are these are like approaches. Like Amazon is still one of the faster e-commerce sites around because they have engineering. They can just throw engineers at solving this problem.
Mm-hmm.
Google has had a web framework that does something like this for a decade now, internally only. Oh God, no. Of course I'm gonna blank on it now. It's not. I'm blanking on
It's
the name
not
of it, but like
called
an
Islands
internal.
in the Sea. No,
No,
just joking.
exactly. None of the fun.
No
Well,
fun
and
name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that idea that these are kind of tools and like technologies and approaches that were locked away in these larger enterprises where
Mm-hmm.
everyone else was using these frameworks that were really nice DX but didn't have the same performance story. So it was
Yeah.
this really fun kind of unlocking something that the big players have known to be true for a decade now.
Totally.
And even going back further than that, like this idea of server rendering, that's like a PHP, that's Rails, that's old school. But what we're able to do is give you a single code base, so you're not paying like the legacy developer experience cost. You get the modern DX with the performance story that matches, a big player who has PhD software developers working on their projects. We're trying to
Totally.
give that to everyone.
Totally. Yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, I think for me, like, I don't know, this is kind of opening up its own can of worms and its own show, but I do have to say it, right? Like, DX, UX kind of been a hot topic debate in our community for a while, right? And I'm personally in the UX camp, right? Like, let's jump hoops to make the experience better. Yeah, it's important to optimize for developer experience for lots of reasons, right? We leads to more time to work on UX, right? And like less ways to break the UX, right? All good things, right? But at the end of the day, it's important for us to like remember what our priorities are. And I think what's really difficult in our community is, our kind of open-based sharing that we have between groups, like on the internet. There's folks working at all kinds of companies talking about ideas. But I think what sometimes we also recognize is we don't the advice that we're getting, or we don't contextualize the practices that we're seeing, right? Like Netflix engineering team, lots and lots of resources at X. What's working for Netflix, or what Netflix is doing, is sometimes solving problems that are very unique to Netflix, and it's not like supposed to be exported and copy pasted everywhere in the world, right? We have to kind of examine that with a grain of salt, and also just, a lot of companies using certain tools maybe have dedicated performance teams, or they have enough experts on staff to manage their usage of those tools or whatever, right? But it's not always one-to-one, right? So there's a lot to you have to kind of choose carefully and also think critically when you see things working for certain groups or being pushed or being used by certain communities, right? You have to just understand what their context is, and if it's not the same as yours, then you have the right to be skeptical, right? So,
yeah, 100%.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's one of my favorite things about this project is like, when we compare ourselves to all these other frameworks, we're not saying, and therefore we're the best for everyone. It's like every other framework that, like the DX and the complexity that they add on, it's for a good cause. You can build really powerful things that are super dynamic and interactive. And if you're building the next Facebook, like, you shouldn't use React, or you shouldn't use Astro. Maybe you shouldn't use React.
Snap.
I don't know.
Oh no!
We're at the end of the
fighting
podcast.
Words.
Let's throw
We're
the
at the
hot
end of the
takes.
podcast. It's okay. These hot takes. Should I? I feel like I should be drinking or something. But yeah, okay. Yes, hot take.
Yeah, we'll do the after show after. No, yeah, Facebook is like, really, there's these really dynamic, there's a lot of user state data flying around, like Next.js and other things are great for stuff like that. And we get to say that, well, knowing that lets us make trade-offs. It's like really kind of scary to say, like, we don't work for all use cases. We're not optimizing for all use cases. Instead, that lets us focus on the use case that we think is really not being served by all the others, because they're focused on that other end of that spectrum you mentioned.
Yeah.
So
But
cool. It's acknowledging your weaknesses and how they actually play to your strengths in other use cases.
Absolutely. And I think it's good to know your audience and good to know your use case. And I think it's important to do that because I think more developers should be thinking about their use. It's not just cargo culting and let's adopt this, does this work for you is the first question. Like, does this solve a problem that you have? So that's really cool. And I think what's interesting is Astro seems to be bridging that gap a little bit for communities that were maybe served by traditional content platforms like WordPress and, other static site kind of CMSs, but like now we're bringing in that DX and all the kind of JavaScript development like into that world. So that's really neat. So we can't end this show without talking about the MPA versus SPA debate. So can you kind of set the context for us here, assuming that I'm a person who maybe has never even heard of a multi-page app? What is a multi-page app? I've heard of a SPA, right? But what's a MUPA? Mapa. Mapa.
It's a little up at the end. Mapa.
Yeah, Mapa. What is the Mapa? What is this Mapa? Tell us about this thing.
So MPAs were kind of it's a term that was almost coined in reaction to SPA. So SPA being the other we've been talking about, the full JavaScript app.
Yeah, I knew there was some nerd beef behind this. Yeah, it's like instead like JavaScript nerds. It's like instead of like having like a dance off. I'm like, it's like I'm gonna come up with an acronym that's like new, make it
really
sound
sticks it
like
to you. Yeah.
It's like oh really next? All right, well here's Nuxt, okay.
I'm gonna write so many think pieces about how I'm smart.
Yeah, this is Nuxter now. The whole that happened with Redux and all the Fluxy things. Anyways. So okay. MPA versus SPA.
It's only relevant because before SPAs were a term, like every website was an MPA. So it was like this term just like didn't need to exist because it was the traditional way of thinking.
You mean like Web 3.0?
Yeah, exactly.
Like what is this thing again? What are we coining? Yeah. When did we rev the again?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can think of MPA as just like it's not a JavaScript app that you're shipping to the client to run your website. So a lot of the new frameworks are, again, I keep throwing out the same names, but
it's all good. It's all good. This is our reality. We are we are in the monoculture of JavaScript era.
Yes,
That's all
it's
good.
the true monoculture of it is even though they're all different, React, Svelte, Vue, they're all following the same model, which is we want you to build a JavaScript app, and then we're going to optimize it as much as we can. But at the end of the day, you're going to send that like full page kind of content down to the user. So React Router is a really good example. It's doing routing on your device. Like your website is running as an application and it's all running in the browser. So it gives you really snappy navigation. It lets you think of your site as an application running on a user's device. Again, there's a lot of benefits to that model for certain use cases. Where MPA and kind of the line is drawn is MPAs are still in that model of the routing is kind of handled by the server. So if I want to navigate to a page, my browser is asking the web server for a new page of HTML. And the optimizations that we can make on that end of things are much more about
much greater too. But,
well,
sorry.
Yeah, no. It's a much less explored kind of future, and it's really interesting seeing some of the proposals that are coming out. Like Chrome is pushing this proposal that lets you, even when navigating from page to page with a full refresh, keeping your shell on the page if it's going to exist on the next one. So you can imagine the SPA navigation story, where you click a link and your page doesn't actually change because it's a JavaScript app fetching HTML and all the complexity there. For the MPA story, it's much more about you're getting the server to generate a lot of the markup for you. And that's the big benefit for performance, is that you're not running an app on a low-powered phone on a bad internet connection. You're streaming HTML down using the model that's kind of existed for the last 20, 30 years around web development of the server is doing all the work. The front end is just making it interactive where you need it.
That makes sense. No, I mean, it really feels like a lot of the problems that we have today are from us just kind of getting away from leveraging the strengths of the browser and the strengths of the web protocol and, and trying to reinvent it and like do everything like, React handling scheduling and thread management and all of this and stuff. And it's like, whoa, super hard job. Appreciate the effort. Wow, impressive stuff. But like, why are we reinventing the wheel in a higher layer? Yeah, no. No, I'm just saying we're reinventing that wheel in a with a much with much less power, with much less horsepower, right? We should just leverage.
We can tie it back to what we were talking about at the start, which is that idea of a lot of the last decade has been more and more complexity to solve the problems that were introduced by that complexity. So you mentioned Uncanny Valley. That is very much a SPA problem that then the SPA needs to add more JavaScript to solve. And React Server components, I think, are a good example of this. It's really cool tech, but you're just building more and more complexity on. Now you need a server framework to even use React to use this feature. It's more and more complexity. So that's the most fun. That's why I love working on this. Is it's a reimagining that strips away the complexity and goes back to some basics that we feel were lost, maybe not for the right reason, or maybe they were lost to give a DX that we think we can now, 10 years later, bring back without sacrificing that story. So instead of adding more and more complexity, we're trying to strip it all away, give you a basic story that beginners love, advanced users love, and we think we've kind of nailed that with this release.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. No, that makes sense. And so now if I'm like want to deploy this thing, use this thing, what's that story like for an Astro app? Because I can't tell if there's a bunch of pre-built stuff or not. Like I don't know where you fall on the spectrum. Can you tell our listeners about that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is that if you go to our website, astro.build, there's a themes showcase, there's an integrations showcase, there's a drop-in integration. I'll put on my lab coat.
Yeah, I know. Right?
For every deploy target.
Commencing. Yeah.
So there's a Netlify integration if you just want to deploy to Netlify, Vercel, Cloudflare. The idea is that and it's really more timing than anything. We've grown up, this project has grown up in a world that's post-Node being the only thing you need to worry about. There's new environments that we need to kind of help you build for, like Cloudflare, that are much more restrictive. Edge, right? It's running close to your users in data centers all over the world. We have been able to build a system that lets you essentially plug that in and will match our output to what you've asked for. So Astro add Cloudflare is going to give you everything you need to start building your site and deploying it to Cloudflare. Another really interesting thing that we do is that we're a static site first. So if you're just trying to build something really quick, the idea of just outputting HTML, JavaScript, and CSS is actually our default. So you can really get started. That's something you can deploy pretty much anywhere as a Jamstack site. And then you opt in to the complexity, my favorite phrase.
Dun,
You
dun,
opt
dun,
in.
dun.
If I need a server that needs to run, I will opt into it. I will tell Astro, no, 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 don't build a static site. Build a dynamic server. It's going to respond to requests as they come in. It's going to handle user input. You kind of opt into that story when you need it, which for some content sites is never. For others, it's day one. We
Yeah.
let you kind of make that jump when you're ready for it instead of being, again, all this complexity on by default.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. No, I mean this is really great. I think it's always refreshing to kind of see new projects, even though again we know that this has been something that has been in the works for a while. We're just going 1.0 now. We just went 1.1 this week with Astro, but it's so great to see where we're landing as a community. It like we are taking that spear and throwing it a little further every time, and we're taking best practices built up, and we're all standing on the shoulders of so many different giants, giants from 60 years ago, 100, maybe not 100, 60 years ago, giants from 30 years ago, giants from 5 to 1 year ago, right? So many best practices seem to be kind of coming into Astro, everything from like, kind of turnkey, like, usage in terms of getting started is easy, turnkey deployments, integrations, support with all of your favorite tools that you've been using and that you're familiar with. And then I think the really cool thing is the, you're kind of really sticking true to that promise of like easy to use, right? Like, so I just kind of releasing this 1.0 with all of these integrations and just even support for deploying to, Cloudflare and that's huge. So it's a very impressive set of like 1.0. I feel like you're pushing the bar a little bit now for applications. Like I'm like, hot damn, if this is 1.0, I don't even want to know what's in store for V2. So, I just
It's gonna be really exciting when we can kind of set the foundation in place, and yeah, I'm really excited for the roadmap we have ahead. And yeah, kind of to your point, credit where it's due. Like this is only possible because we can see and learn from other people in the open source ecosystem. So we're definitely taking some features that we love from Next and SvelteKit. A lot of these things we're not building in isolation. There's real inspiration from pretty much everyone from every kind of framework. We found things that we love that we brought into Astro. So we get to make our big bets, but then also rely on things that have been proven out by others, which is a really nice thing to be able to say.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Fred. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'll have lots of links in the show notes for everything that we talked about today. And yeah, check out Astro. It seems like a really fun project to definitely play with, but also I'd say the docs alone are really, I think, a great read. There's just lots of great ideas and lots of fun little quotes. So, you should go find them. So that's it for this week, everyone. We'll catch you next week. And thank you very much. It's great to be back today. Bye, y'all. Outro. Sorry, I accidentally clicked. I don't know what I did. I stopped recording like about 2 minutes ago. So I think
I
everything.
still see recording up in the.
You
I'm
do?
still recording.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad something went wrong with.
Yeah, you are
mine.
not though. I see that.
Yeah, it's okay. They'll just use my local for the last minute. But
Sure.
I think we're good. I just wanted to say thank you. This was so fun.
Real quick, I think you need to stop recording for me. I'm still recording, and it says don't close this window.
Yeah, hold on. Does it say upload complete?
No, it just says recording, uploading 99%, so it's almost done. But I'm still going, and there's no
You're
button
still
that I see to
going.
turn that off.
Okay. Yeah, it says refresh. Hold on. Let me try refreshing. See what happens.
Yeah, I see disable, mute, but no, I'm still going. Still recording.